Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing the McMartin Preschool case. The McMartin Preschool case began in the early 1980s. And in order to really understand the case, you have to understand what was going on in the United States at that point in time, or the context in which the case took place. So the 1980s was known as the era of satanic panic. And satanic panic basically was the fear that there were people who worship Satan, that they worship the devil, and that they were involved in all sorts of horrible, heinous crimes. There was this belief that Satanists committed murders and that these murders were ritualistic in nature, and that Satanists were involved in sex crimes and the molestation of children. And again, there was a ritualistic element here. And some people believe that Satanists were actually involved in organized crime, and there was an organized crime element to Satanism. And Satanists were blamed for creating child pornography and for filming murders. Um, and if all of these allegations weren't bad enough, there was this overwhelming belief that Satanists were everywhere, that there were Satanists among us, and that they were basically hiding in plain sight, and that Satanists existed within the ranks of government. So much how there was this concern about communists at the time of the Alger Hiss case, there was a concern now about Satanists being involved in the government and making decisions, and also that there were Satanists in entertainment. Um, the band Kiss, if you're familiar with the band Kiss, they were criticized as Satanists, and it was said that KISS was an acronym for Kids in Satan's Service. There was a lot of fear about the number 666. This was the devil's number, and supposedly, if you found 666 in a barcode, it indicated that Satanists had manufactured that product or had something to do with the distribution and sale of that product. So there was a lot of fear about Satanists and ritualistic crimes and Satanists just in various aspects of society. And this existed probably until about the early 1990s. Now, looking back in retrospect, we know that a lot of these concerns were groundless and a lot of this was just mass hysteria. And that there were not satanic murders and there were not satanic cults. And if there were, they certainly didn't elevate up to the concern that people had about them at the time. So this is the backdrop in which the McMartin Preschool case really uh, began under. And the case actually got started in Manhattan Beach, California in 1983, and it began simply enough with a mother named Judy Johnson calling the police to report that her 3-year-old son, Billy, had been molested by a teacher at McMartin Preschool. And Billy attended McMartin Preschool for daycare. And so the police arrested the teacher, and he was a gentleman named Ray Bucky. And then they continued their investigation. And as part of this, the police chief sent a letter to all of the parents of children who attended McMartin Preschool, indicating that the police were investigating the school and investigating these allegations of sexual abuse, and that Raymond Bucky had been arrested and was the target of these investigations. And the letter gave these very graphic descriptions of sex acts that may have been committed against the children, and asked parents to talk to their children to see if any of these things were done to them or if they witnessed any of these things being done. Well, as you might imagine, in a community where probably a good majority of the parents sent their kids to this preschool, this created a lot of fear and a lot of panic in the community. And this would get worse over time, certainly before it got any better. So Judy Johnson was in contact with the police and continued to feed them information that she claimed came from her 3-year-old son, Billy. And so the allegations against the Buckies and against McMartin Preschool teachers just became more bizarre and outrageous over time. So, for instance, Johnson said at various points that Ray Bucky and other teachers at McMartin Preschool were Satanists and that they involved the children in satanic rituals, that there were secret underground tunnels and rooms underneath the preschool in which children were taken and molested, that child pornography was made at McMartin Preschool, and that other adults would come to the school to molest kids, or that the kids were taken to offsite locations where they were molested by other adults. And there were also allegations that there was animal sacrifice and that kids were forced to watch animals being killed or participate in the murder of animals. And basically, we're told that if you talk about any of this, this is what will happen to you. And so you had these very bizarre allegations coming from Judy Johnson and her son Billy. And this just added fuel to the fire that was started really also with the letter from the police chief. And so you had a number of parents now coming to the police, coming to the district attorney with concerns that their children had been molested or exposed to some of these things at McMartin Preschool. And so, in response to this, the DA consulted with an institute that was known for counseling children that were victims of abuse. And this was called the Children's Institute International, or CII. And it was headed up by one of their lead counselors, Key McFarland. And so, if parents came to the police or the DA with concern about their child possibly being molested at McMartin Preschool, they were referred to CII for an interview. And these interviews went on over the next couple of years. And in the end, 400 children had been interviewed by CII counselors, and approximately 384 of those children had been diagnosed as having been sexually abused. So, in response to this, McMartin Preschool was shut down. Parents filed lawsuits against the school and against teachers. There was concern about other preschools in the area, so they were raided by the police, but ultimately nothing was found. And the media began covering the case quite extensively and really highlighting some of the more bizarre allegations that were made by the children. Ultimately, charges were filed against 7 individuals that were connected with the school, specifically Ray Bucky. His mother, Peggy, and his sister, Peggy Ann Bucky, were charged. Virginia McMartin, who was the founder of the preschool, was also charged. And some other teachers were also charged with various sex crimes that were allegedly committed. Despite this, there was actually very little physical evidence recovered. So the police searched the homes of the McMartin Preschool teachers, and they found no evidence. And they found no evidence at the school. No physical evidence was collected. The McMartin parents and the DA even contracted an archaeologist to dig underneath the school to try and find these tunnels and these secret rooms, but ultimately nothing was found. They didn't find any evidence of this. And so the case then went on to a preliminary hearing, and the defense just took this role that none of these allegations were realistic, and the defense alleged that Key McFarland and the other counselors at CII had used unsound interview techniques in talking with the children, and that basically the counselors had used leading questions, coaching, pressure, positive reinforcement, and kind of guided the children to answer the questions in the way that they wanted them to. And so what the children were saying was probably not the truth, but that these thoughts about abuse were induced by the counselors and by the interview techniques that were being used. And so the case dragged on through the legal system, and I'll leave it up to you to read about this uh, in the links that I provided to the famous trials website. You can find those links in the module. But basically, this case went on for a period of about 7 years, and there were two trials. And the final outcomes of all of these legal proceedings were that all the parties were acquitted. You had hundreds of children that were emotionally damaged by this case and by the interview techniques that were used by the counselors. You had the careers of the staff of the preschool completely ruined and their lives ruined as well. And the case ended up costing the state of California about $15 million over the course of the 7 years that this case was ongoing in the legal system. So anyway, I'll leave it up to you to read about the case. There were some very complex issues. A couple points that I just want to raise quickly here. Um, so we have some allegations of prosecutorial misconduct in the fact that the prosecution did not reveal exculpatory evidence to the defense. So if during the course of the investigation the prosecution uncovers evidence that shows that the defendant is innocent, they are legally obligated to provide this evidence to the defense. And as it turns out, there was a lot of evidence uncovered with respect to the innocence of the defendants that the prosecution just did not share with the defense in this case. And some of this evidence came to light because a TV crew was filming a documentary about the case while it was ongoing. And basically, the TV crew found out through their interviews that several prosecutors did not believe the allegations were true, but they pressed on. They found out that Billy's mother had severe mental problems, and they also found out that Billy did not identify Ray Bucky in a police lineup. And so these were facts that ultimately would have helped the defense, but the prosecution did not reveal these facts at the time. And so this was obviously very controversial. And again, we see the use of improper interview techniques, and that the children very clearly were coached what to say um, by these counselors, and the fact that they asked these very leading questions. And so we have just a lot of different issues going on here with the McMartin Preschool case. Obviously, a very complex case and convoluted case, to say the least. So that pretty much wraps it up for the discussion. If you have any questions, I encourage you to send me an email, and I would be happy to address them.